labor data show that even after months of improvement, women's participation in the labor force is still at a 30-year low. We're also witnessing what is called the Great Resignation. Americans have been quitting their jobs in record numbers. 4.3 million people told their bosses to take this job and shove it last August. All of these factors are having a big impact on how businesses operate, recruit, and retain their workers, and really doesn't leave any room for error on how you manage your workforce. So here today to get into some details on this topic are some experts in the field. Dr. Christelle Slaughter is the CEO of SSA Consultants from the Baton Rouge area of Louisiana. Dave Zimmerman, who is the global president of a company called Deputy, is from the Silicon Valley area in California. Welcome, Christelle and Dave, and I'd like to start by turning the microphone over to Dave to share with us some of Deputy's findings from a recent survey of shift workers. Dave, welcome.
Hey, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm actually really thrilled to be here. I really am, and I'm blessed that I got this opportunity. What I wanted to do is, well, I'll first introduce myself really briefly to give you some context, but I want to share some data. It's some data that we just released on the shift work economy, and I think it'll illuminate the conversation in an interesting way to start. So first off, I'm Dave Zimmerman, Global President at Deputy. We're a software company that's trying to make shift work simple. We are employed today by about 250,000 workplace locations that employ shift workers, and we're there to help them scheduling, time and attendance, being compliant, paying people accurately, and optimizing their workforce. So there's a lot of things that we focus on, but one of the things we do just by way of helping companies do this is we have a lot of data on shift workers. So what I thought I'd do is just really quickly share just a few slides. I'll do it quick, so this won't be a slideware kind of a chalk talk. I'll keep it really quick. But I want to frame this in a way by talking about the shift work economy. So the shift work economy is a big portion of the US economy. And unfortunately, a lot of the press coverage today tends to focus on what is inherently desk jobs. So when we talk about the return to the office, for example, inherently that's looking at a slice of the economy and not paying attention to shift work. When we talk about, what is Google doing or what is Coca-Cola doing? Again, we tend to focus on the white collar jobs and what's happening with those and all the changes that have happened in the pandemic. But what I'm going to focus on just for the next 3 minutes is what's happening with shift work. So the data set that I'm going to share with you comes from this massive corpus of the shifts that we track for our customers. We have heavy concentration in hospitality and healthcare and retail and services. As you can see, this is not like a survey of 200 people. This is a massive corpus of data and some really interesting findings. So I have two things I wanted to share in particular. One is, and this is pretty interesting, it turns out that women have less shift stability than men, meaning that even though women represent 62% of the shift economy, of shift workers, they tend to get less shifts than men do. It's an interesting finding. I'll talk for a second on what the implication of that might be, but it is a bit surprising when you look at the data at this scale and see that kind of difference. Another one is kind of bursting the perception or the myth that shift work is done only by the young. We all have this in our heads. I'm sure all of you, when you think of shift work, you think of that young person that's on the job somewhere. And the reality is that we have a very mixed group, very mixed population when it comes to the generations and who's doing shift work. In fact, baby boomers on average tend to get more shifts in a month than the younger generations do. It's kind of a fascinating finding. I think those of us that employ shift workers, lots of our customers know this from their own employee base, but even those people tend to think writ large that it tends to be a very young occupation. So what does all this tell us? What does this mean? What should we take from this? Well, number one, I think we all need to be very sensitive when we think about how do we employ shift work, right? Some of the perceptions we have aren't correct. Secondly, I'd say we have to recognize the fact there may be some unconscious bias here. So when we think about how shifts are allocated between men and women, between the generations, we should be aware that there's somebody making that decision at a company, so a scheduler, a day shift manager, head of operations. And if they're aware that there may be some unconscious bias at play, they can allocate shifts in a way that's best for the company and doesn't include that bias. And the third thing I'd say is we have varying degrees of tech adoption among these generations. So let's be honest with ourselves. Baby boomers are less likely to be really savvy on a smartphone. And so as an employer, we all need to be aware that when we think about how do we communicate with these employees, how do we allow them to get information, how do we let them work? So anyway, that's just a few of the high level conclusions. If anyone's interested, you can get the full report. This comes from a report that we produce called the Shift Work Economy Report. And you can get it at deputy.com. You can navigate from there or just go to insights/chamber. So with that, what I'll do is I'll stop sharing now so we can get back to more of the conversation.
Well, thank you, Dave. I was just typing in the URL to kind of do a belt and suspenders approach to sharing the URL that you graciously just shared with us. And I'm going to turn it over to Christelle. So before I ask you a substantive question that builds on Dave's presentation, just tell us a little bit about SSA. And in full disclosure, Christelle and I are dear friends. Christelle was for some time the chair of the group that I run at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce called the Small Business Council. So if you sense a familiarity by video, that's because we've worked together for several years. So welcome, Christelle. Tell us a little bit about SSA.
Thank you, Tom, and it's great to be here with you and the group today. SSA Consultants is a management consulting company that was actually started in 1970. So we are celebrating over 50 years of continuous operation. About 2 years ago, I became the president and CEO. And our mission is to help our clients, whether they're for-profit businesses or other types of organizations, to be more successful. And with our topic today, of course, we're doing a tremendous amount of leadership development, trying to fill the gap that has been caused by so many people leaving the workforce, a lot of executive coaching, succession planning, and now a lot of compensation studies. So I think our topic is very relevant, and I'm very anxious to get started with it.
Well, thank you, Christelle. And let's just dive into what Dave touched on in his presentation. I mean, Dave used a really good example of, like, if you were to examine the data from your shift work and see that the majority of your shift workers are older and don't have a comfort level with their smartphones, obviously you're not going to be insta messaging them to get them to show up to their shift because they're not quite sure how to operate their smartphone. So that's a very kind of obvious conclusion from some data. And Christelle, in your work, you obviously are familiar with other data small businesses can use to enhance productivity. Can you touch on some data tracking strategies or insights about where small businesses should go to access data in order to operate either more efficiently or even figure out how they can use data to perhaps pivot in a direction that might be more successful for them?
Sure, absolutely. I think that those of us who are data hounds would not really think about doing anything or making a major decision without checking on data. I find that a lot of our small business clients are very good at looking at their own data and trends over time. We have a tendency to move very quickly in organizations, and we don't always take time to step back, and we like to call them post-mortems, but actually it's to do an overview of where we've been and what has been happening while we were so busy just trying to keep the lights on and do our jobs. And so figuring out how do you really accurately look at your turnover rate, and what are the jobs that are turning over the most, and what are some theories or feedback or exit surveys telling us about that, and what are the people who are staying telling us about why they stay. So certainly taking your own data and stepping back and spending a little bit of time with colleagues looking at that and refreshing your thoughts about it can be extremely helpful for that particular organization. The Chamber of Commerce has tremendous information. The co-website is fabulous. I refer our clients to it all the time. And if you want to type it in the chat box, Tom, that would be terrific. But I think that there's also such a wealth of resources online now. And for organizations that are small and maybe don't have a full-time human resources director, joining SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, they have fabulous, very current information, advice. So I think that, you know, if you have someone who is dedicated to doing that, you can pull a lot of data off the internet that can be very useful for your needs.
Well, thank you. And, you know, the first person to pose a question or observation in the chat, a gentleman by the name of Donald, pointed out that a lot of employers are forcing employees to quit, and a lot of folks would rather quit than be fired. And I think what one of the things that you mentioned, Christelle, is that if there is a recurrence in a particular job type in your business that is continually open and is filled with non-performing folks who very quickly learn they're about to get fired, then perhaps using that data, it's time to step back and assess the position, not the fact that, you know, to blame it on a bunch of folks who are candidates for the position perhaps being suboptimal. So you actually already gave a good example of something that is kind of internal looking to address a problem that wouldn't be necessarily obvious unless you really took a data-driven approach. And you do work with businesses on hiring and firing a lot. How often does that come up where a business you work with, Christelle, has a particular position in their company that is just churning through employees all the time, and you have the unique pleasure of pointing out the obvious, saying, it's not the candidates, it's you.
That's right. It happens quite a lot. And interestingly enough, clients oftentimes have a blind spot. You would think that it would be patently obvious. We keep hiring for this position over and over again, but they don't necessarily see those patterns, again, because they're busy themselves. Since the pandemic, we're seeing some very interesting things. A recent Harvard Business Review study showed that 41% of the people surveyed are planning to quit within the next year. And this is as a report to their employers. They're very unhappy. 54% say they're overworked, but 39% say they are exhausted. When I read this, we had an all-staff meeting, and I looked at my colleagues in the eye and all of our staff, and I said, if we're exhausted, if 39% of us are exhausted or maybe more in our company, we need to talk about that. Right. Unfortunately, in the study, it showed that 61% of the leaders reported that their people were thriving, that they were working hard, that they were working remotely. Everybody's doing great. So I do think we have a huge disconnect there. And I think, unfortunately, and you brought this up, Tom, what we're seeing are companies that are shortcutting their hiring processes. I was behind a truck the other day for quite a long time on the interstate, and on the back of the truck it was painted sort of, come work for us, you know, great job, great benefits. We hire on the spot. And because I was behind the truck for such a long time, I thought, now that's good and bad. So I can get a job right away, but I can also quit a job right away. And there's a whole new sort of cottage industry of people who are ghosting jobs, where they find places like that, or a place that might have a sign-on bonus. They come in, they go through the employee processes on board, they work just enough to get that first paycheck, and then they're gone. So you kind of have to recheck, are we doing a good job of bringing the right people in, like you said? Are we being realistic? We don't want to oversell the job. And then do our incentives for bringing people in also help with retention? So you get a sign-on bonus, but you don't get it for 90 or 120 days. So those are some of the techniques that are important.
Well, thank you, Christelle. You brought up a term, blind spots, and Dave, I'm going to shift to you to kind of fill this in, because I would suspect in your role you are able to identify for your client companies many blind spots. Can you run us through some of the blind spots that you're familiar with? Now, we don't want to name names here, but perhaps, you know, maintaining their anonymity, you can kind of lead us through some blind spots that have been illuminated through data provided by your company, Deputy.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do it. I mean, so most of our customers are small businesses, but we do have a lot of enterprises, companies like Ace Hardware, Dutch Bros, which is a drive-through coffee chain, just went public. Those larger enterprises, they publish public statistics on the turnover rate of their employees. They're massive. I mean, if you think about it, if you run a large enterprise and your hourly workers turn over 40% a year, that means you're literally, not only you have to hire for your growth, but you have to hire the 40% back that you lost over the course of the year. So we tend to give advice in 3 areas, and we tend to see 3 gaps that companies need to focus on. And I'll hit one of them right now, but basically workplace efficiency, like people need to get more efficient. So their demand for labor in the enterprise is efficient. Second one is they obviously need to be compliant legally, and that's more tough. That's tougher these days where, you know, fair work week laws are flowering. There's a lot of diversity of regulation in the country. And the third one is this employee engagement. This is the one that's worth hitting right now, which is we think about the fact that the labor market is so tight, and on top of that, it's hard to keep the people that you are already employing. And I'd say job one is get your employee base that you're working with today to be engaged. And so, like, I want to tell a really quick story which will illuminate this. I was at the headquarters of Dutch Bros last week, and I drove through the coffee stand, their original first ever coffee stand. I spoke to they call the runner, the person that takes your order. Her name was Larissa, and I asked her what she liked about using Deputy, whatever. She told me a little bit about it. One of the things she mentioned is she likes to be able to put in when she's not available to work in the system, so she doesn't get scheduled then, because she has 2 jobs. And honestly, this is not uncommon, right? An employer has an hourly worker. That person needs to have enough shifts every week to pay their bills. And so a lot of people are running 2 different jobs. Now just picture this, if you're not scheduling them with enough predictability in advance, right? Then you're letting them find another job. You're asking them to find something else because they don't know if they're going to get enough shifts. If they can't clearly see and manage their schedule, you know, you're putting them in great risk, because that unpredictability is going to be a problem. And so when we talk to employers, we tend to say, hey, look, give as much predictability as you can to your employees. Be sensitive to the fact that the reality of the workforce is people work for multiple companies a lot of times. And that hanging on to your employees by giving them a good experience is what's going to matter the most. And then you'll minimize the amount of recruiting and hiring and retraining you have to do.
Well, I think you've hit on something that a lot of folks are desperate for, and that is certainty. The idea that if you're an employee, and quite frankly, if you're an employer these days, there's something you can do to provide certainty. It goes a long way. Let's narrow right into something that you mentioned, Dave, about flex work or or even working at home. Now, you set the stage very well, saying, look, we're tending to focus on the future of work as remote work, but that unfortunately ignores most of shift workers. But we know that there's a hybrid here, right? So there are many organizations that have both shift workers and employees who are working remotely. And it gets complicated really quickly because of either perceived or real inequities of treatment. Are there data tools that small businesses can use or look to try to smooth this kind of new way of working in those areas where there are some folks who may want flexibility of working remotely in conjunction with shift work? Dave, I'll turn to you first, and then Christelle, I'll go to you right after.
Yeah, I'll give you a quick answer, which is something that is an easy recommendation for every company, which is if you're not measuring engagement of your employees, you don't know really where you stand as an employer, and you don't understand the issues that your employees are facing. And so once a quarter, you should survey your employees. There's lots of free or very inexpensive ways to set up an online survey of your employees that's anonymous. We just released a new feature in Deputy, so whenever anyone clocks out on their app, on their phone, they get a quick pulse check. How are you feeling today? And you get choices. You can answer that. You can basically structure the question the way you want. The idea is you need a pulse on your employees, and if you don't have that pulse, then making choices about how often people come to the office and what happens with people who can't come to the office because they don't work close enough anymore. And how do you keep the balance of engagement for those people that are full-time remote, or those people that are hybrid, or those people that come into the office all the time? It's a real problem. So I guess simple recommendation is just measure engagement. Keep an eye on it.
Well, Dave, let's shift from Silicon Valley, where you are, to Silicon Slopes, which is a little bit further east in Utah. And Christelle, one of our friends in Utah, was explaining to me this conference they were at where 90% of the CEOs said, I want all my employees to come back in person. And then they surveyed the employees, and over 70% of employees and candidates to work in high tech said they don't want to go to the workplace. So how is this resolved? And getting at Dave's point, where are the data points to try to make decisions to get towards resolving just a really big gap on what CEOs want and what employees want?
Yes, and that's true across the country and really across the globe. We found out during the pandemic that people can be productive, and they can be engaged, and they can work remotely. And a lot of employees who are very talented want to continue to do that. And they do have, as you said, childcare issues, and they do have a lot of other pressures right now. So the companies who are figuring out how to let that happen as much as possible in areas where it is possible to do that, I think are going to be the talent winners in the talent war, because good employees are going to look for that. People are mobile. If you think about remote work, I can be in Salt Lake City and work for our company in Baton Rouge. It really doesn't matter. So we're seeing a lot of that. And what Dave was talking about maximizing employee engagement, that's a very, very good way to increase productivity without having to hire additional workers. And so smart companies are realizing they need to unboss people. So let's unboss people. Let me see how smart you really are. Let me see how creative you really are. Let me see how self-disciplined you really are, rather than putting terminals on your machine that check in as soon as you log in and tell me how long you've spent on a particular form or site or whatever. Or as one of my clients told me the other day offline, she said, they put a big red box She's in insurance and she's supposed to be looking for new clients. They put a big red box when I go to the Safari to look up a business and see if they're a potential client. She said, it's really hard to do my job. And I said, who is they that puts up the red box? She said, my employer. They don't want us playing on the internet. So I said, but that's part of your job. How are you doing your job? And she said, with my phone. She said, I use my phone. And I'm thinking, can we make people's lives any harder as employers? I want you to, get us some new prospects, but I'm going to block you, big red box, from using the internet. So I think we have to sort of back up sometimes and think about, our people want to feel appreciated. They want to feel cared for. They want to be inspired. If you can't make people feel cared for and inspired in this environment today, shame on you. We have a small rum distillery that when the pandemic hit, they switched, they pivoted, and they started making hand sanitizer. Do you know how important their employees felt? Do you know how wonderful they felt about being able to go home and tell their friends and family, this is what we're doing, okay? We are helping our country, we're helping our community. This is easy to do. Your people can think of these ideas. You can work on them remotely as well as together. So I think if we can do, as Dave was saying, work on employee engagement, I think that that's a great way to save money and be more successful and retain people in the long run.
Well, Christelle, thank you. We're getting a lot of love in the comment box about unbossing, and just to combine the term unboss with something that came up earlier. I suspect that unbossing has to work in conjunction with laying out clear expectations for performance. I'm going to turn to Dave and ask him a little bit about some upskilling stuff. But before we do, how do you advise employers to combine the unbossing with greater clarity of expectations for performance?
Is that for me, Tom, or Dave?
Oh, yeah, Christelle, for you. And then I'm going to go to Dave with a upskilling question.
Yes, you have to have clear expectations, and you have to support people. As you begin to encourage them to use their brains more, they may not have the best judgment. They may be a little bit off on something. And so rather than correcting them or having some moment where you make them actually feel bad about trying to handle the situation, you need to support them and you need to coach them and you need to provide mentors, whether those are colleagues with a little more experience or actually other people who are not necessarily their direct supervisor. So I don't think we take advantage of the resources that are really available to us. Clarifying expectations is important. Showing people where their results really are in comparison to someone else. I have to proof everything that you do. We catch errors, whereas somebody who we think is a high performer is producing something that doesn't have to be reviewed. It can simply be sent on. Those are the kinds of things people need to hear to understand, well, what does really good performance look like? And I will get more responsibility as I hit those marks. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Christelle. Dave, let's continue on this thread about doubling down on existing employees. Let's look at your experience in businesses that have shift workers. There's such a tension and using really the data from your company, Deputy, on scheduling the right people at the right time. How do you use your data and advise your clients about upskilling and training that those employers want to invest in existing employees? Because it's kind of that gray area where folks want to help, but it may not lend itself specifically to an efficiency shift operation schedule. How do you reconcile those two things?
Sure. Yeah. Great question. And this is all of a piece. I love unbossing too. I hadn't heard that before. I think that's great. there's part of a mindset shift here, which is that if the labor market tightens dramatically, we need to think differently about how to invest in our own employees. And so that gets to, the theme of unbossing is a great theme and a great way to express it. In addition to that, it's about, well, what does the employee want to get out of their experience? Where do they want to go in their career? And that gets to upskilling. And so if you don't provide opportunities for people to grow, they will find those opportunities elsewhere. So the finding opportunities to grow is something employers can do. You can't, bend over backwards and change your priorities as a company, but there's lots of opportunities for upskilling. And if you just think about the career pathing in companies, if you are aggressive about defining those pathways and the skills that people need to develop and being precise about that, and then giving your employees the opportunity to develop those skills, you're not only helping them progress in their career and grow, but you're helping to fill future leadership roles and more advanced roles in your company with people that you've already trained and are already in-house. So like we see this a lot, like in Deputy, the first thing you do when you create a schedule of your shift work is you create areas of work. So think about like a simple cafe. You might have somebody who works busses tables, somebody who's a cashier, somebody who's a barista, somebody who's a cook, and each of those requires certain skill sets. And so you define what skill sets are required, and then you identify who has the right set of skills, and that's how the system can schedule the right people for the right roles. But why not take the next step, which is create training programs to let people develop the skills they want in the next role that's important to them. And if you don't do it yourself, somebody else is going to do it for you, and that means you're going to have a slot to fill in your employee ranks.
Well, Dave, I love how you're talking about the next role. Even just thinking about that invests that employee into a future in the company. So I think that's a great takeaway. Now we're going to we're about to go into more questions and answers. There's some already in the chat that I'll try to scroll through, but I do want to encourage folks to keep the observations and comments coming. But if you narrow in on a specific question that Christelle or Dave might be able to answer, please think about that and put that in the chat. But before we do get to those questions, let's turn just for a few minutes to workforce. How do you find the workers? Now, I'm a little bit biased. I think small businesses actually have a unique advantage because there is more often a clear line of sight between an employee's performance and the mission that is the mission of the business, and it happens in a direct communication and relationship with the boss, where you're more likely to have that as a small business. But again, I'm a small business lobbyist, so I'm a little bit biased here. Christelle, in your advice to different clients on human resources and personnel, what's your advice to them about how do you find, hire, and even before that, recruit a pipeline of talent that will benefit your company?
Tom, that's a wonderful question. And I sort of collect great ideas from clients and readings and that sort of thing. So I think there are 5 things that I would recommend. First of all, check your brand reputation. Whether it's Glassdoor or simply scrolling through your competitors' posts on Facebook or LinkedIn. I had someone tell me the other day, one of our small business council members owns 368, a wonderful creative advertising firm. And someone told me the other day, I want to go work for Kenny Wynn at 368. And I said, do you know him? And she said, no, but he has the greatest posts on LinkedIn. And they just like they're having fun. And I'm not having any fun, and I want to go have fun with people. So it's your brand reputation. Never stop recruiting. I have a client who will, he said, salespeople are salespeople. I don't care if they're selling shoes or rugs or insurance or whatever. They connect with people, they understand the buying motives. And so he is constantly trying to recruit more salespeople. It's almost embarrassing. He'll be in Walgreens and he'll say, hey, boy, you sure have a good way with customers. Have you ever thought about coming and selling XYZ? And I'd have to walk away when he does that. Use your employees as recruiters. A lot of people have referral bonuses, and those are wonderful. But I think sometimes putting together, especially if your people are overworked, take a little break time, buy them all donuts or whatever, and then sit down and say, we have some openings. Let's brainstorm. Where could we find some people that we would like to work with? Where are talented people? Where are people who could come into our team and do a good job? And let's brainstorm. Even if you're not personally thinking of someone, you may know avenues for that. The fourth one, actually, Tom, I got from a Small Business Council member who hired a consultant, if you remember, to improve his employees' LinkedIn profiles. And they did such a good job that they were all picked away. So I think 3 out of his 5 top people were headhunted away because their LinkedIn profiles were so good. So the other side of that story is, why aren't you looking on LinkedIn? Why aren't you trying to figure out, where do I have a connection? So if I went to the Ohio State, can I look for people in this area who went to Ohio State that I can message and I can ask? Or a particular job that's hard to fill, a skill set, et cetera. Look for talent all over social media. It's very easy to do. And the last one is, make sure you're competitive. And by competitive, I mean not only in terms of your compensation and benefits, but in what Dave was talking about a moment ago, the skill sets that they bring to the table, how you add to those, how you help people progress. The last point is, I know that people today are more expensive to bring in than they used to be, but it is a mortal sin to bring in a new employee at the same or a higher rate of pay than someone who has been with you for a long period of time. And the compression that is causing inside of organizations is tough, but don't be surprised when people quit when they find out that the new person may even make more than they do. It's just not a good way to do business. So 5 thoughts.
And thank you, Christelle. So it's going to be hard to add to that list of 5 because you covered the waterfront and really, really good takeaways. And so thank you. And so Dave, just anything to add? I know that your company that mostly examines shift work for existing employees. Have you learned anything about how some of that data is used to recruit?
Yeah, there's a lot there. Recruiting, especially in today's environment, is a pretty rich field. I mean, Christelle covered a lot of really good ideas, really good suggestions for recruiting. I think one of the things that we try to enable is I'll just go back and I mentioned our 3 recommendations we typically have, which is around workforce efficiency, getting good at legal compliance, then employee engagement. Back to that efficiency, one of the things we discover when we get deployed is often that there are times in a business where you don't have the right allocation of labor. So if you got a bit more efficient, the burden on recruiting might be a bit less. So many small businesses, I have to tell you, like 85% of the small businesses that sign up with Deputy are coming from a place where they were scheduling their hourly workforce through some analog means, poster on the wall, email chain, shared spreadsheet, that kind of thing. But so we're at the beginning of the wave of technology adoption in small business. This is still early days. And I think if you think about it for a minute, you'd probably, even if you're a diehard analog, like I run my business in the real world kind of person, you'd probably recognize that eventually we're going to be in a world where small business is going to run very efficiently through use of technology. It's not just about scheduling. There's lots and lots of components of running a business that need to get more efficient. One of the things that we find is if you are in retail, for example, you have a point of sale system usually, which allows you to track the demand coming in. How many people are coming into the store? What are they buying? When are the peak demand times of day. If you could match your employees to that demand, you could be a lot more efficient in terms of when do I really need the staffing. This is something that can be done easily with technology. But again, it's like this wave of adoption hasn't happened yet. And so the blunt force rule is, yeah, yesterday I was short, I need to hire another person. But if you could manage your existing workforce better, you might be able to minimize the need to go through what is today a pretty painful process of recruiting.
Well, Dave, thank you. So we're going to turn to some participant questions, and I'm noticing that the term paradigm and culture show up throughout a number of the comments and questions. And Christelle, you already mentioned our friend Kenny Wynn, who runs a public relations firm in the Baton Rouge area called 368. And if anyone does some kind of Google snooping on Kenny, you just get this wonderful picture of an incredible entrepreneur who is fun to work with. But make no mistake about it, it is hard work. And Dave mentioned employee engagement. And Christelle, you talked about the brand and the reputation. What is that reputation? And while it may seem all sunshine and roses and fun, it takes a lot of hard work and focus to get to that point. So can you talk a little bit about not only the importance of culture and aligning everything you do with culture, but like what is some of the hard work to get there, and how do you incorporate that into your hiring and recruiting process?
That's a great question. I'm not surprised that it showed up, the word culture showed up a lot in the chat box. If you had a strong culture going into the pandemic, when everybody dispersed and people started trying to work remotely, you were buffered a bit for a period of time. If you had a weak culture or a dysfunctional culture, it made all the gaps exposed. And so I think some people realize, gosh, culture's important. People feeling supported by one another, feeling supported by management, a culture that values our contributions is really important. Trying to get that during the early days of the pandemic, if it wasn't there, was very, very hard to do. But we have got to figure out how to do that now with all these hybrid models, as you and Dave have been talking about. And I think that organizations that become focused on that actually sit down and define, this is the culture that I want to have. Trust is important, or trust isn't important, or I think it's important that we work as a team, or I really don't necessarily want my people to work as a team. I want independent operators who produce. And those are choices that a business owner or a leader makes along the way. Research shows there are some characteristics of high-performing organizations, and they are cultural elements, and they do have to do with trust. To a certain extent, they have to do with teamwork. They have to do with collaboration, and they have to do with people believing that the mission of the organization is something that they can get passionate about and that excites them, even if it's mundane. So instead of seeing that we're, an ice cream shop and we're scooping ice cream that's hard to scoop out, I'm making somebody's day a little bit brighter. I'm helping a mom have an experience with her children that might be the best thing that happens this week. Some people think that way naturally. Sometimes leaders need to help their people recognize those things and talk about those things. And I think one of the best things that I've seen happen with Zoom and Teams and things like that are our clients who are using it to have sort of a cocktail hour or a coffee moment. And people bring in those kinds of stories and cultural sort of heroes and cultural stories that really enhance and reinforce the bonds that we're trying to build. So I think even in these challenging times, we can do it.
Well, Christelle, you're talking about a journey towards really defining and focusing in on the culture. And I get the sense that that's done in a more transparent way now between CEOs and employees. It's quite frankly been like that for a long time for many small businesses, because many times it's family members and other folks who are like family. But we see kind of a broadening of wrestling through these things in a fairly open way. And Dave, I'm going to have you look a little bit internal to Deputy instead of internal to some of what your clients have gone through. You know, when you first started out, you said Deputy's mission is to make shift work simple. A great elevator conversation with a building that only has 4 floors. You have it down, it's concise, it makes sense. And obviously it took a while to get there. And I suspect that Deputy as a company is continuously working through what is this mission? Are we all aligned? Should our mission be different? How are employees engaged? Can you walk us through a little bit about Deputy's approach to its culture and its paradigm and what lessons we might take from it to better run our businesses?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked. I really am. We went through an exercise during the pandemic to codify our mission, our vision, and our values. And a lot of it was present already. You could kind of feel the culture of the company, but it wasn't written down. So it was hard to get everybody really aligned and to be really clear about how we were going to measure whether we were following our values and whether we were on our mission. So yeah, our mission statement is simplify shift work. That's 3 words. You know, the important thing was to keep it short if we're going to simplify something. And our vision, which is what do we want the world to look like if we accomplish our mission? That's what a vision is. Our vision is just 5 words, which is thriving workplaces in every community. And the idea is that, you know, we wanted to express clearly, why are we doing this? You know, why are we trying to do this as a company? And values, I won't take everyone through our 5 values, but we went through an exercise of sitting with the employees of the company in small groups. And we actually got to most of the employees at the time participated in the exercise to give us feedback about what sounded like Deputy and what didn't sound like Deputy, what was important and what wasn't important. We aggregated all that. We went through several rounds of iteration, and you could see our first attempt wasn't quite right. And we went back at it again, because what we wanted to do, and what everyone should think about, is if they can come up with a mission like that ice cream shop, make more smiles could be the mission, something like that. But if you want to come up with that mission, you want to think carefully about what you're trying to portray. Because just in the case of Deputy, we wanted to provide a rubric that everyone can use. So when we recruit new people, when we evaluate performance, we have a clear set of values to measure people against. And it can be aspirational. It's not like you're perfectly walking the walk on all your values all the time, but this is where we want to go. And it needs to ring true to some degree too, right? It needs to be part of who Deputy is as a company. So we went through that exercise. It does not have to be complicated to go through it, but you need to be inclusive in terms of working with your employees. Because if you come up with something, one person, the CEO, comes up with it, prints it out, puts it on the wall, that's where it's going to stay. That's where it's going to stay, really. But you want at that ice cream shop, when the owner is training somebody who's going to scoop ice cream, you want to say, now remember, we're doing this because we want to make smiles. So it's not just about getting the ice cream on the cone and handing it to somebody. It's about the effect we have on people. So you need to bring that energy to this experience, right? And just imagine going in an ice cream shop that has that experience versus some big chain where people are just taking your orders and handing you ice cream, right? That's going to make a big difference.
I'm reminded by another small business owner. She runs a sheet metal fabrication manufacturing operation just north of Minneapolis, and her team were producing metal parts for the respirators that were essential to save lives, still are to save lives by folks stricken with COVID, and connecting the task of making a small metal disc with saving someone's life in an emergency room was something she was so passionate about. And I remember seeing that they were in every batch, they were putting a handwritten note by the machine operator on the manufacturing floor, introducing themselves and how proud they were to help contribute to saving lives in COVID. And I think that Dave and Christelle, that kind of gets at that line of sight between doing a task and accomplishing a mission, not always reaching it, but at least having a clear line of sight of what is intended and what is hoped for and what's aspired to. And coming up with that requires the input of both that manufacturing employee on the floor as well as the CEO of the company. And I think some of the takeaways that I've gotten from our conversation here, a couple of really important things. One is measure engagement. And Dave, I loved how you really narrowed in that that's a data point. Because sometimes we don't think about engagement as a data point. It's kind of the warm fuzzy stuff, but it's not. It's a data point. And I loved how you focused on that. And then I also loved, Christelle, how you kind of dove into the importance of culture, company culture, and really emphasized the hard work that it takes from both the employees and the CEOs to define it and get buy-in amongst the whole team. So thank you so much, both of you. I'm going to do a quick lightning round, and then we'll close out on one piece of advice for a small business that's struggled, but they can see the light at the end of the tunnel from the pandemic. What's one piece of advice you've learned from some of your clients that you'd like to share with some of these folks that can just see that light at the end of the tunnel? Dave, you first.
Sure. I'll come back and refine a point I made earlier, which is that shift workers are very concerned about predictability. You know, the shifts are what they use to fund their lives, to pay their bills, to pay their rent. And so what we saw, unfortunately, happen at the beginning of the pandemic was employers started scheduling workers less far in advance because the world became less predictable. So whereas typically on average workers are scheduled 2 weeks in advance, that shrank down to 1 week immediately when the pandemic hit. Now that we've seen that come back, but that's a simple thing employers can do to provide more predictability to their workforce. And then in effect, what you're going to do is you're going to make it easier for your employees to stay with you because they know they're getting work from you. So doing the work of being more predictable will make a big difference.
And Dave, let's not leave out the parents of teenagers like I am. You know, when they're working some part-time shift, to have it scheduled 2 weeks out helps the parents too. So thank you for mentioning that. You
got it.
Christelle.
Tom, I'm so glad you gave me one more bite at the apple. Your employees are not you. Your employees are not the leaders, and they're certainly not the owners. And we need to remember that. The reason why people are overworked and exhausted is, as one of my clients said to me the other day, but I've got to keep pushing because I do see the light at the end of the tunnel. And we are starting to make strides, and our customers are coming back, and I can't stop now. Well, I'm sorry, you need to put your employees first. Good employees create good customer relationships. And for me to leverage off of my employees to make a buck is really not fair to them, and I will pay for that in the long run. And we're struggling with that in our company. We have more work than we can handle. We are blessed with the group we have, and we are starting to say no, or we can't get to that yet, or it's going to take this. And that is a very, very difficult situation to be in, but our employees recognize it and appreciate it. and come forward and say, you know what, I was thinking about it. We might be able to squeeze that in November if we work hard at it. So again, take care of your people and they'll take care of you.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Christelle. And thank you, Dave Zimmerman, both of you for joining us today, and to our audience for engaging with comments and questions throughout. Please be sure to check out our next workshop, Small Business, Big Secrets, Protecting Your Proprietary Information, which begins in 2 minutes at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you.